Christmas Eve has a way of making silence louder. In small towns like this one, where snow settles gently on familiar streets and every window glows with warm light, memories don't knock. They simply walk in. And sometimes what returns is not a person, but a truth that waited years to be heard. Hazel believed she had already survived the hardest part of her life. She stayed when someone she loved walked away. She rebuilt herself quietly, brick by brick, season after season. She learned how to smile again, especially at Christmas, even when something inside her still felt unfinished. Brian was never supposed to come back. Not after the way he left. Not after the words he never spoke. Not after the letter he wrote and hid because he was too afraid to send it. But on one cold Christmas Eve, when the town slows down and hearts grow more honest, that letter finally arrives. Not by intention, not by courage, but by fate. The kind that waits until love is strong enough to face the truth. What happens when the words you needed years ago reach you too late? Or maybe, exactly when you're finally ready to hear them. Tonight's story is not about perfect love. It's about regret, growth, forgiveness, and the quiet redemption that only Christmas can bring. It's about learning that some endings are not punishments. They are pauses, waiting for the right moment to become beginnings. Stay with us until the end, because this is a story about second chances that don't arrive with fireworks, but with humility, healing, and hope. If you believe Christmas can still redeem broken hearts, subscribe to Redeemed Hearts, and let this story remind you. Sometimes love doesn't return to repeat the past. It returns to rewrite it. The night everything broke did not arrive with screams or slammed doors. It came quietly, wrapped in cold air and unspoken expectations. The town looked the same as it always had, lights glowing softly through frosted windows. Hazel remembered thinking that ordinary nights were the most dangerous ones. They disguised themselves as safe while holding the power to change everything. She did not know that this night would become a reference point in her life, a before and an after she would never stop measuring herself against. Hazel had loved Brian in a way that felt natural, unforced, and deeply rooted. There was no grand drama in the beginning, only presence and familiarity. They shared coffee on quiet mornings and laughter that filled empty spaces. With him, she felt seen without having to perform. She believed that love was built exactly like that, slowly and honestly. Nothing about their relationship felt temporary to her, and that certainty was what made the fracture so devastating. Brian, on the other hand, carried restlessness like a second heartbeat. He loved Hazel, but he also feared the weight of permanence. Opportunities beyond the town called his name louder than he admitted. He told himself that leaving was not abandoning her. He convinced himself that distance would clarify his feelings. But deep down, he was afraid of choosing wrong and staying trapped. Fear dressed itself as ambition, and he mistook one for the other. That evening, the air between them felt heavy before any words were spoken. Hazel noticed it in the way Brian avoided her eyes, in the pauses that lingered too long between sentences. She sensed a shift she could not yet name. Something fragile was being tested without her consent. Her heart leaned forward, searching for reassurance. But reassurance never came. When Brian finally spoke, his voice sounded distant even to himself. He talked about needing more, about feeling stuck, about possibilities elsewhere. Each word landed like snow, quiet, cold, accumulating. Hazel listened without interrupting, her chest tightening with every sentence. She waited for him to say it was temporary. She waited for him to say he would come back. But what he offered were explanations, not promises. Hazel asked only one question, spoken softly but filled with meaning. "Is this goodbye?" Brian hesitated, and that hesitation answered everything. Silence stretched between them like a widening crack. She realized then that love could exist without courage, that someone could care deeply and still walk away. And that realization hurt more than anger ever could. He left that night without turning back. No dramatic scene, no shouted accusations, just a door closing and footsteps fading into the cold. Hazel stood still long after the sound disappeared. She felt something inside her collapse, slowly and completely. The house seemed larger, emptier, unfamiliar, as if it no longer recognized her either. In the days that followed, Hazel moved through life mechanically. She went to work, greeted neighbors, completed tasks, but everything felt muted, as though she were watching herself from a distance. The town continued celebrating the season as if nothing had happened. Christmas lights were hung with cheerful efficiency. Music played in stores, full of joy she could not access. Her pain felt invisible, and that made it heavier. Brian, far away, found no relief in leaving. The freedom he imagined felt hollow almost immediately. He replayed the night over and over in his mind. Hazel's quiet composure haunted him more than tears would have. He wondered if he had made the bravest decision or the weakest one. Guilt settled into his chest like a permanent ache. Yet pride kept him from turning back. One night, overwhelmed by regret, Brian sat alone with a blank page. He began writing without knowing exactly why. The words poured out faster than he could organize them. He wrote everything he had failed to say aloud. About fear, love, and the mistake of leaving without honesty. That letter became a confession he was not ready to deliver. So he folded it carefully and hid it away. Hazel never knew about the letter. She believed that silence was all Brian had chosen to leave her with. That belief shaped her healing in quiet, painful ways. She learned to rely only on herself, to trust consistency more than passion, to protect her heart with structure and restraint. Love became something she remembered, not something she pursued. Years passed, and the town watched Hazel grow steadier, stronger. People admired her resilience without understanding its cost. She smiled often, helped others, stayed involved. But she never allowed herself to hope again. Hope felt dangerous, like reopening an old wound. She told herself she had made peace with the past, but peace and numbness often look the same. Every Christmas something inside her tightened. The lights, the songs, the shared warmth, all reminders. She participated, but with emotional distance, as if joy were something meant for others. She learned to survive the season gracefully. No one suspected how much effort that required. No one guessed what she carried quietly. Far away, Brian kept the letter through every move. It traveled with him from place to place, unopened, unresolved. He told himself he would send it someday, when the timing felt right, when he felt worthy of forgiveness. But that moment never seemed to arrive. Fear delayed what courage demanded. Time changed them both, but it did not erase the connection. It simply buried it under layers of life and distance. Neither Hazel nor Brian understood that unresolved love does not disappear. It waits, patient and persistent, sometimes quietly, sometimes painfully, and sometimes it waits for Christmas. Hazel believed the story had already ended. She had accepted that some questions remain unanswered, that some people leave and never return. She told herself closure was unnecessary, that strength meant moving forward without explanations. But the heart does not always agree with logic, and it remembers what the mind tries to forget. Brian believed he had forfeited his right to return. He assumed the past was sealed beyond repair, that Hazel had surely moved on without him. He did not imagine that silence could still echo years later, or that a letter could survive time itself, or that Christmas had a way of reopening doors he thought were forever closed. Neither of them knew that the night everything broke was not the end. It was the beginning of a longer journey, one marked by growth, regret, and quiet endurance. And soon, by a truth that refused to remain hidden. A truth written in ink and sealed with fear, waiting for the moment it would finally arrive. On a Christmas Eve that would change everything. Hazel did not rebuild her life overnight. There was no dramatic turning point, no sudden strength. Healing came in fragments, scattered across ordinary days. She learned how to wake up without expecting his presence, how to fill silence with routine instead of longing, how to keep moving even when her heart resisted. Survival became her first quiet victory. She stayed in the small town everyone assumed she would leave. Some thought it was loyalty, others called it fear, but Hazel knew the truth was more complicated. The town held her memories, both painful and tender. Leaving felt like abandoning a version of herself, so she stayed, choosing familiarity over escape, and learned how to belong again, alone. Work became her anchor. She showed up early, stayed late, and earned respect slowly. People trusted Hazel because she was consistent, reliable in ways that didn't demand attention. She helped organize events, supported local initiatives. Her presence became woven into the rhythm of the town. Purpose replaced what love once gave her. Friendships filled spaces romance no longer occupied. She laughed, listened, supported others through their own struggles. Hazel became the woman people leaned on, the one who always showed up. No one noticed how rarely she asked for help herself. Strength, she learned, could also be a disguise, one she wore convincingly. Love, however, remained carefully distant. She dated briefly, politely, without expectation. She smiled, engaged, but never fully opened herself. Her heart stayed guarded, wrapped in caution. She believed vulnerability required safety, and safety was something she no longer trusted easily. So she chose control instead. Hazel told herself she was content, not ecstatic, not broken, just steady. She learned to appreciate calm over intensity, predictability over passion. She built a life that did not rely on anyone else. Independence became her shield, and also her loneliness. The town admired her growth. People spoke of her resilience as if it were effortless. They praised her for moving on so gracefully. Hazel accepted the compliments with polite smiles. No one asked what it cost her to be this composed. No one saw the nights she stayed awake thinking, or the emotions she kept carefully folded away. Christmas, however, always tested her defenses. The season softened everything, and that frightened her. Lights, music, familiar traditions stirred old feelings. She participated but never fully surrendered to the joy. She volunteered, baked, decorated, smiled, but something inside her stayed on guard, as if happiness required supervision. Every year, she helped organize the town's Christmas events, tree lightings, charity drives, community dinners. She believed service grounded her during the season. Giving kept her heart outward-facing. It distracted her from what the holidays once meant, from who she used to share them with, from what she lost. At night, when decorations glowed softly through her windows, Hazel sometimes paused longer than she intended. She would stare at the lights, lost in quiet reflection. Memories surfaced without warning. Not dramatic scenes, just ordinary moments. Laughter in the kitchen, shared glances, warmth. The kind of memories that hurt, precisely because they were simple. She never spoke Brian's name aloud anymore. It felt unnecessary, indulgent, dangerous. Time had placed distance between the memory and the man, or so she believed. She convinced herself that closure was overrated, that not every story required an ending. Some simply faded into silence. Yet part of her wondered who she might have been. Had things unfolded differently? Had courage arrived sooner? She rarely allowed herself that question. Dwelling on the past felt like betrayal of her present. So she focused on what she could control and left the rest untouched. Hazel's life became defined by balance. Enough social connection to avoid isolation, enough solitude to maintain safety, enough routine to feel grounded, enough distance to avoid disappointment. It was a careful construction. One wrong shift could undo it all. She believed she had learned everything she needed about love, that it required alignment, timing, and courage, and that missing any one of those could be fatal. She promised herself never to beg for clarity again, never to wait for someone else's readiness. She would choose herself, every time, even if it meant choosing less. Unbeknownst to her, Brian was not gone from her story. He existed quietly, in the background of her becoming, in decisions shaped by loss, in walls built with precision, in the caution she mistook for wisdom. His absence had taught her many things, but not how to fully let go. As this Christmas approached, Hazel felt unusually restless. She couldn't explain the tension beneath her calm, a sense of anticipation she refused to acknowledge. She told herself it was nothing, just seasonal sentiment, just fatigue, just memory playing tricks. She did not know that the life she built without him was about to be tested, not by his return, not yet, but by words written long ago, words that carried truth, regret, and courage delayed. Words she never expected to read, words that would reopen everything. Hazel believed she had mastered the art of moving forward. She trusted the stability she created. She felt prepared for anything, except the past. She did not know that Christmas had its own timing, that some truths wait patiently, and that what was buried is not always gone. Sometimes, it's only waiting to arrive. Brian thought leaving would bring clarity. He imagined distance would quiet the questions that haunted him. He believed motion could replace courage. Instead, the farther he went, the louder his thoughts became. Cities changed, addresses shifted, faces blurred. But the memory of that night stayed sharp. It followed him like an unfinished sentence. At first, everything felt promising. New opportunities, unfamiliar streets, a sense of reinvention. No one knew who he had been before. No one expected him to stay. He could become someone new without explanation. Freedom tasted intoxicating. Briefly, then it began to feel hollow. Brian worked hard, chasing stability he thought would justify leaving. He told himself success would ease the guilt. If he built something meaningful, the pain would make sense. He climbed steadily, earning recognition and independence. But every achievement felt strangely unshared. There was no one waiting to celebrate with him, and that absence echoed louder than failure. Relationships came and went without consequence. He kept them light, avoidant, surface level. Commitment felt dangerous now. He feared repeating the same mistake, or worse, facing it. So he stayed emotionally mobile, never fully arriving, never fully belonging. At night, when the noise of the day settled, regret crept in. Not always dramatically, sometimes quietly. In the way he compared strangers to a familiar face. In the moments he wished someone knew his history. Hazel's presence lingered in unexpected places. In silence. In memory. He replayed that final conversation endlessly, analyzing his own words with increasing cruelty. He wondered why fear had spoken louder than love, why he had chosen possibility over certainty, why he believed leaving was safer than staying. The answers never satisfied him. They only revealed how unprepared he had been. Brian learned that guilt does not fade with time. It adapts, disguises itself, waits. Sometimes it showed up as ambition, other times as restlessness. But it was always there, a quiet reminder of the cost of avoidance, a weight he carried alone. One evening, years after he left, something broke through. He found himself standing still, unable to outrun the feeling anymore. The life he built looked complete from the outside, but inside, it felt unfinished. He realized success had not absolved him. It had only distracted him. And distractions eventually fail. That night, Brian sat down and wrote the letter. Not carefully, honestly. He wrote about fear, immaturity, and regret. About loving Hazel but lacking the courage to stay. About leaving without offering her truth. The words poured out raw and unfiltered. It was the first time he faced himself fully. The letter was never meant to ask for forgiveness. Not yet. It was a confession without expectation, an admission of failure without defense. He did not paint himself as misunderstood. He took responsibility. That alone felt like progress. When he finished, he read the letter once, then folded it carefully, hands unsteady. He imagined Hazel's face reading those words. Her reaction frightened him. Pain, anger, indifference. All felt deserved. So he chose silence instead. He kept the letter close, moved it from place to place, tucked it into drawers, boxes, luggage. Each time promising himself he would send it someday, when the timing was right, when he felt braver, when fear loosened its grip. But timing became an excuse. Bravery remained elusive. Years passed and the letter aged. The ink stayed clear. The courage did not. He convinced himself Hazel had moved on, that contacting her would only reopen wounds, that silence was kindness. Deep down, Brian knew that was not entirely true. Silence protected him more than her. It allowed him to avoid consequences, to delay accountability, to live with regret rather than risk rejection. Fear disguised itself as consideration, and he let it. Every Christmas something shifted inside him. The season stripped away distractions. It reminded him of warmth, home, and belonging, of the life he walked away from. He wondered how Hazel spent these days now, whether she still lived in the same town, whether she had forgiven him or forgotten. This year, the weight felt heavier. The letter no longer felt dormant. It felt unfinished, like a truth demanding release. Brian sensed that running was no longer an option. Something was drawing him back. Not hope, responsibility. He didn't plan to return for reconciliation. He didn't expect redemption. He only knew he couldn't keep carrying this alone. The past had waited long enough. Avoidance had cost him years, and now it was demanding payment. In honesty, Brian did not know how the letter would resurface. He did not imagine it would travel ahead of him. He could not foresee Christmas intervening, but something had shifted inside him. The man he became far from home was no longer running. He was finally ready to face what he broke, even if it broke him in return. Brian returned to the town without announcing himself. There was no dramatic arrival, no clear intention, only a quiet decision made after too many sleepless nights. The road looked smaller than he remembered. Familiar turns stirred memories he thought were buried. Each mile felt heavier than the last, as if the town itself was waiting. Snow covered the streets in soft layers, unchanged by time. The town square glowed with Christmas lights. Everything looked warmer than he deserved. Brian parked his car and sat still for a moment. He watched people pass, laughing, carrying bags, greeting each other. Life had continued beautifully without him. That realization hurt more than rejection ever could. He did not go looking for Hazel. Not because he didn't want to see her, but because he feared what seeing her might do to him. He told himself he was only passing through, that staying was unnecessary, that restraint was the kindest choice, even if it felt like punishment. From a distance, Brian noticed how the town had grown. New storefronts, restored buildings, subtle changes. Yet the essence remained. Familiar voices echoed across the square. Laughter carried easily in the cold air. It felt like stepping into a preserved memory, one he was no longer part of. Hazel first sensed his presence without seeing him. A sudden stillness passed through her, an awareness she couldn't explain. She paused mid-task, heart tightening unexpectedly. She told herself it was nothing, just seasonal emotion, just fatigue. When she finally saw him, it wasn't dramatic. No collision, no spoken words, just a glimpse across the square. Brian stood near the edge, half-shadowed by lights. Older, quieter, unmistakably him. Hazel's breath caught before she could stop it. Time folded in on itself. She did not approach him. Shock held her in place. Memories rushed forward uninvited. The boy she loved, the man who left, the absence that shaped her life, all standing in front of her at once. Brian saw her too. The moment landed like a blow. She looked stronger, steadier, rooted. Not untouched, but resilient. He realized she had grown without him, and that realization both comforted and crushed him, because it proved she never needed him to survive. Their eyes met briefly. No smiles, no anger, just recognition, a shared history surfacing silently. The past did not demand explanation. It simply existed between them. Brian looked away first. Not out of indifference, but respect. He knew showing restraint mattered now, that forcing a moment would dishonor her boundaries. So he stepped back and disappeared into the crowd. Hazel stood frozen long after he left. Her body remembered what her mind resisted. She felt shaken, unprepared. Years of emotional control threatened to unravel. She forced herself to breathe, to stay present, to not chase a ghost. That night, she questioned everything she thought she had resolved. Seeing him reopened doors she believed were sealed. Her heart reacted before permission was granted. Anger surfaced, followed by grief. Not for what was, but for what never had the chance to become. The wound felt fresh again. Brian spent the night alone in his car. He told himself he deserved the discomfort. Seeing Hazel confirmed what he already feared. He had caused real damage, and time had not erased it. It had only shaped it into something deeper, something harder to undo. He considered leaving before dawn, convincing himself he had seen enough, that returning had been a mistake. But something kept him still. Not hope, not entitlement, responsibility. Hazel slept poorly that night. Dreams tangled past and present. She woke unsettled by her own reaction. She told herself seeing Brian changed nothing, that she owed him no space in her life. Still, her chest felt tight, as if truth was pressing closer. Morning arrived quietly. Snow continued to fall. The town prepared for Christmas Eve. Hazel moved through her routine with effort. Everything felt slightly off balance, as though something unresolved hovered nearby, waiting. Neither Hazel nor Brian understood the full significance of that moment. They believed it was simply an encounter, a coincidence, a reminder. They did not yet realize it was a warning. The past had not returned for nostalgia. It had returned with purpose. Because some reunions are not meant to heal immediately. They are meant to unsettle, to disrupt the false peace built on avoidance. The return Brian didn't plan was already reshaping the story. and Christmas had only just begun. The letter did not arrive with ceremony. There was no knock filled with urgency, no warning that something old was about to resurface. It appeared quietly, slipped among ordinary envelopes. Hazel noticed it only because of the handwriting. Something about the ink felt familiar. Her heart reacted before her mind could. She held the envelope longer than necessary. The weight of it felt heavier than paper. Hazel told herself it was coincidence, that memory was playing tricks on her. Still, her hands trembled slightly. The past does not announce itself loudly. It waits to be recognized. When she turned the envelope over, her breath caught. Brian's name stared back at her, written in a younger hand. Careful, intentional. Her first instinct was to put it down, to walk away and preserve her balance. But curiosity mixed with unresolved grief. Hazel sat at the kitchen table, lights dimmed, snow falling outside. Christmas Eve pressed softly against the windows. She stared at the letter as if it might disappear. Part of her resented its timing. Another part feared what it contained. The silence in the room felt charged, as though the moment itself was watching. She opened the envelope slowly. Not out of hesitation, out of respect. Respect for the girl she used to be, for the woman she had become, for the years between those two versions of herself. Once opened, there would be no return. Some truths cannot be unread. The first line unraveled her. Brian's words were not defensive. They did not justify his leaving. They admitted fear, regret, cowardice. Hazel felt each word land deeply. He wrote about loving her without knowing how to stay, about confusing ambition with escape, about leaving because he believed she deserved more than his uncertainty. Hazel read those lines twice. Her chest tightened painfully, not because they were cruel, but because they were honest. Tears blurred her vision, but she kept reading. Brian described the night he left in painful detail. The silence, her expression, the moment he realized he had broken something sacred. He did not ask for forgiveness. He only asked for understanding, and that restraint hurt more than pleading would have. Hazel felt anger rise alongside grief. Anger at the delay, at the years she spent healing alone, at the timing that felt almost cruel. Why now? Why Christmas Eve? Why after she had learned to live without answers? The letter continued, softer now. Brian admitted he never sent it because he feared rejection, feared causing her pain again, feared confronting consequences. Hazel exhaled sharply. Silence, she realized, had never been kindness. It had been avoidance. By the time she reached the end, her hands were shaking, not from weakness, but from emotional overload. Years of unresolved questions collapsed into one moment. She had imagined this conversation countless times, but reading it felt different, more intimate, more dangerous. Hazel folded the letter carefully when she finished. She did not know what to do next. Confrontation felt inevitable. Forgiveness felt distant. Denial felt impossible. The truth had arrived, and it demanded response. Outside, church bells rang softly. The town prepared for Christmas Eve gatherings. Joy moved freely through the streets. Hazel felt disconnected from it all, as if time had slowed around her. She sat alone with the weight of words, words that changed everything. She wondered how the letter found her. What chain of events allowed it to surface now? She suspected accident rather than intention. That thought unsettled her, because it meant fate, not courage, delivered the truth. And fate offered no explanations, only timing. Hazel thought of Brian standing in the square days earlier. His quiet presence, his restraint, his distance. The letter reframed that moment. It revealed a man still burdened by remorse, still carrying unfinished truth. Her heart struggled to catch up with her mind. Compassion surfaced unwillingly. She resisted it, not because she lacked empathy, but because empathy felt dangerous. She had worked too hard to remain steady, and this threatened everything. Hazel realized that reading the letter was not the hardest part. The hardest part was knowing she could not ignore it. Truth, once delivered, demands reckoning. Silence was no longer an option. Neither was pretending indifference. The story she believed was complete had reopened, and it would not close easily. That night Hazel did not sleep. Christmas Eve stretched long and restless. The letter rested folded beside her bed, a physical reminder of unfinished business. The past had finally spoken, and the next step would change everything, whether she was ready or not. Hazel did not plan the confrontation the way people imagine confrontations happen. There was no rehearsed speech, no dramatic build-up, only a quiet determination that settled in her chest after a sleepless night. The letter had stripped her of the luxury of avoidance. Pretending indifference now felt dishonest to herself. She did not seek closure. She sought truth. And truth, she knew, would not come gently. She found Brian where she expected to. Not hiding, but not inserting himself either. He stood on the edge of the town's Christmas preparations, helping silently, stringing lights, carrying boxes, staying invisible. The sight unsettled her more than arrogance would have. This was not the man who left impulsively. This was someone trying to atone without permission. When Brian saw Hazel approaching, his body stiffened instinctively, not with fear, with awareness. He knew this moment was inevitable. He had imagined it in fragments for years. Her expression was calm, but not soft, controlled, but not cold. It was the look of someone who had already survived worse. Hazel did not greet him. She held the letter between them instead. Folded, familiar, heavy with years. "I read it," she said, her voice steady but quiet. The simplicity of the statement carried devastating weight. Brian swallowed hard. No defense prepared him for this. For a moment neither spoke. The sounds of the town continued around them. Laughter, bells, music. Life moving forward while they stood frozen in time. Brian finally nodded. "I never meant for you to get it like that," he said. Hazel met his eyes. "That doesn't change what's written." She told him what the letter did to her, how it reopened wounds she spent years stitching closed, how it answered questions she learned to live without, how the timing felt almost cruel. Brian listened without interrupting. He did not correct her pain. He let it exist. When he spoke, there was no performance in his voice, no justification, no self-pity. "I was afraid," he said simply. "Afraid of choosing wrong. Afraid of staying and failing you." Hazel's jaw tightened. Fear, she realized, had dictated too much of her life already, and she refused to let it excuse his silence. "You don't get to explain absence after years of silence," she said. Not sharply, honestly. "You left me to build strength without answers. You don't get credit for regret you kept to yourself." Brian nodded again, slower this time. "I know," he said. "And I live with that every day." That was what shook her most. Not remorse, but accountability. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask for a second chance. He did not even ask to be understood. He simply stood there, open and exposed, accepting whatever consequence came next. Hazel felt anger rise again. But it was different now. Less sharp. More grief than fury. She realized she wasn't confronting the boy who left. She was confronting the man who carried it with him. That difference complicated everything, because anger was easier than nuance. and this moment demanded nuance. "I didn't need perfection," she said quietly. "I needed honesty." Brian closed his eyes briefly. "I know," he replied. "I thought leaving would hurt less than staying unsure." Hazel shook her head slowly. "You don't get to decide what hurts less for someone else." The truth settled between them heavily. Neither tried to soften it. Christmas lights flickered above, indifferent. Hazel felt exhausted. Not physically, but emotionally. Years of self-protection loosened slightly. Not enough to forgive, but enough to acknowledge complexity. She told him she didn't know what she felt yet. That compassion did not equal reconciliation. That understanding did not erase damage. Brian accepted that without argument. "I'm not here to fix anything," he said. "I'm here to stop running." That honesty landed deeply. They stood together longer than necessary, not touching, not retreating, just present in discomfort. For the first time, Brian did not try to escape the moment. And for the first time, Hazel did not push him away completely. The space between them felt different. When Hazel finally turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "This doesn't mean anything yet," she said. Brian nodded. "I understand." She hesitated. "But it means I'm listening." And that was more than she planned to give. As she walked away, Hazel felt something unfamiliar. Not relief, not closure, but possibility, fragile and undefined. She hated that feeling, and needed it more than she admitted, because numbness had grown heavy. Brian watched her disappear into the crowd. He did not follow. He did not hope. He simply breathed. For the first time in years, he had told the truth out loud. Whatever came next, he would face it awake, not hiding behind silence. The confrontation did not heal them. It disrupted them. It cracked the foundation Hazel built so carefully. And it stripped Brian of his final illusion. But sometimes redemption does not arrive as comfort. It arrives as truth that refuses to be ignored. And Christmas had only begun its work. Hazel did not forgive Brian that day. Not after the letter. Not after the confrontation. Forgiveness did not arrive as relief or clarity. It arrived as confusion, heavy and unsettling. She realized that healing was not linear. It was layered, uneven, and painfully slow. She spent the following days quieter than usual, moving through routines with deliberate care. Every familiar place now carried new meaning. The town felt the same, yet different, as if truth had altered its shape slightly. Hazel listened more than she spoke, trying to hear herself beneath the noise. Brian did not approach her again. He kept his distance intentionally, not out of fear, but respect. He understood that presence without pressure mattered now. Redemption could not be rushed. It had to be earned in silence, through restraint rather than insistence. Hazel noticed him anyway, not because he sought her attention, but because absence has a different weight once acknowledged. She saw him helping quietly at every Christmas preparation, lifting, repairing, offering time without recognition. No grand gestures, no explanations offered. She questioned her own reactions constantly. Why compassion surfaced so easily? Why anger softened when she least expected it? Why memory felt less sharp now that truth existed? She reminded herself that empathy did not require reconciliation, that understanding was not surrender. Still, the boundaries felt harder to maintain. Forgiveness, Hazel realized, frightened her, not because it excused the past, but because it reopened vulnerability. To forgive meant admitting she still cared, and caring meant risk. She had built her life to avoid risk. Forgiveness threatened that stability. At night, she replayed Brian's words. Not defensively spoken, not manipulative, simply honest. She weighed them against years of silence. and found neither erased the other. Both had shaped her equally. The town continued its Christmas rhythm. Children rehearsed songs. Lights were tested and retested. Community meals were prepared. Hazel participated as always, but now she felt exposed, as if her inner life mirrored the season's fragility. Brian watched her from afar with quiet discipline. Every instinct urged him to explain more, to clarify intentions, to apologize again. He resisted all of it. He knew repetition would cheapen sincerity, and restraint was the only proof he had left. Hazel recognized that change in him, and that recognition unsettled her more than words, because change implied effort, and effort implied sincerity. She had learned to distrust both. Yet his consistency challenged her assumptions, not loudly, persistently. She wondered if forgiveness meant inviting him back into her life, or simply releasing herself from carrying the weight alone. The distinction mattered. One felt dangerous. The other felt necessary. Hazel began to understand that forgiveness might be something she did for herself, not a gift she owed him. Brian, meanwhile, confronted his own expectations. He did not assume forgiveness would come. He did not hope for romance. He focused only on presence, on doing what was right regardless of outcome. That discipline was new to him, and humbling. Their paths crossed occasionally. Brief glances, quiet nods. Nothing more. But each interaction carried less tension, less defensiveness. Something subtle was shifting. Not resolution. Readiness. Hazel noticed how her body responded differently now. Less rigid, less guarded. Still cautious, but softer. She hated herself for noticing, and relieved herself by acknowledging it. Truth had dismantled numbness. Forgiveness, she realized, was not forgetting. It was remembering without bleeding, without rage, without self-betrayal. She wasn't there yet, but she could see the path, and that mattered. Christmas Eve arrived quietly. Snow fell steadily. The town glowed with anticipation. Hazel felt a heaviness lift slightly, not because everything was resolved, but because she was no longer hiding from truth. And that felt like progress. Brian stood at the edge of the square that evening, prepared to leave if needed, prepared to stay invisible. He told himself that loving her now meant choosing her peace, even if that peace did not include him. That acceptance felt like growth, and also like loss. Forgiveness was not a moment shared between them. It was a process unfolding quietly. Inside Hazel, inside Brian, inside the space they no longer feared. And as Christmas Eve deepened, both stood closer to a choice that would define what came next. Christmas Eve arrived without urgency, but with weight. The kind of weight that settles quietly in the chest. The town glowed as if holding its breath. Lights shimmered against falling snow, soft and deliberate. Everything felt suspended between what had been and what could be. Hazel walked through the square, aware of every step. This night demanded more than routine. She had told herself she would simply attend the event and leave. Smile politely. Participate as expected. Remain intact. But something inside her resisted that plan. Truth had already disrupted her carefully built distance. Pretending neutrality now felt dishonest. Hazel watched families gather, couples exchange quiet laughter, children run freely. She felt both included and separate. Present, yet reflective. This was the life she had chosen. Stable, safe, controlled. And yet safety suddenly felt incomplete, as if something essential had been missing all along. Not love. Courage. Across the square, Brian stood near the edge of the crowd. He had positioned himself deliberately away from the center, close enough to help if needed, far enough to leave unnoticed. He told himself that restraint was love now. That presence did not require permission, and departure did not mean failure. Hazel noticed him almost immediately, not because she searched, but because awareness no longer frightened her. Seeing him did not cause panic, it caused stillness, a quiet acknowledgement of unfinished truth, and a choice waiting to be made. She remembered the girl she used to be, the one who waited, who hoped silently, who mistook patience for loyalty. She honored that version of herself now. Not with longing, with gratitude. She had survived what once broke her. Hazel also saw the man Brian had become. Not through promises, but through restraint, through accountability, through the willingness to stand still instead of fleeing. This was not the boy who left. This was someone changed by consequence. The music softened as the ceremony began. Candles were passed from hand to hand. Light spread slowly, intentionally. Hazel held her candle and felt its warmth. Forgiveness, she realized, felt similar. Not dramatic, but deliberate and steady. She understood then that forgiveness did not mean erasing the past. It meant refusing to let it dictate the future. It meant choosing honesty over fear, presence over avoidance. It did not promise certainty. It offered possibility. And possibility felt worth the risk. Hazel stepped away from the crowd, not toward Brian, yet. She needed to choose herself first. She breathed deeply, grounding herself in the moment. This decision was not about loneliness. It was about alignment, and alignment required intention. Brian noticed her movement and tensed instinctively. He prepared himself for distance, for silence, for nothing at all. He reminded himself that he owed her nothing but respect, that hope was not entitlement, and redemption was not guaranteed. When Hazel finally approached him, it was unhurried, unforced. She stood in front of him without accusation, without expectation, only presence. "I'm not ready to forget," she said softly, "but I am ready to stop carrying this alone." Brian did not respond immediately. Emotion threatened to rise unchecked. He swallowed hard, steadying himself. "I don't need forgiveness tonight," he said quietly. "I only need to be honest from now on." Hazel nodded. That answer mattered. They stood together beneath the lights, not touching, not separate, sharing silence without discomfort. For the first time, the space between them felt safe, not because pain was gone, but because truth was present. Hazel realized then that love did not need urgency. It needed patience, consistency, and choice. Daily, intentional choice. She did not promise a future. She offered a beginning, and that felt enough. Brian did not reach for her hand. He waited. When she finally took his, it was steady, not desperate, not uncertain. Two people standing equally. No one chasing, no one fleeing. Snow fell heavier as the candles were raised. The town shimmered with quiet joy. Hazel felt warmth settle where numbness once lived. Not because everything was healed, but because she was no longer hiding from truth. Redemption did not arrive loudly. It arrived honestly. Christmas Eve did not erase what had been broken, but it reshaped it into something wiser, stronger, more real. The letter had finally done its work, and love, at last, had chosen to stay. Christmas did not change Hazel and Brian overnight. There was no illusion of instant healing, no promise that erased years of distance. What Christmas offered them was something quieter. The courage to remain present, to stop running from truth, to choose honesty even when it felt fragile. The days that followed were gentle and unhurried. They spoke slowly, carefully, not reopening every wound at once, not pretending the past didn't exist. They allowed silence to coexist with words. learning that connection did not require constant reassurance, only consistency. Hazel noticed how different this beginning felt. There was no anxiety beneath her hope, no fear of being abandoned without explanation. She did not feel smaller for opening her heart again. She felt grounded, rooted in the woman she had become, strong enough to choose with clarity. Brian learned how to stay without controlling the outcome. He showed up without demanding reassurance, without rushing intimacy, without expecting forgiveness as payment for regret. He understood that love was no longer about intensity. It was about responsibility and presence. Day after day, they rebuilt connection the way it should have been built the first time, with truth spoken early, boundaries respected, time honored. There was tenderness but also realism, hope but no fantasy. What grew between them felt earned. Hazel realized that forgiveness had quietly taken root, not as a declaration, but as release. She no longer carried the weight alone. The letter no longer hurt when she remembered it. It had fulfilled its purpose. It told the truth that silence never could. Brian never forgot the cost of leaving, and Hazel never forgot the strength it took to stay. Those memories did not divide them. They grounded them. They became reminders of how easily love can be lost, and how intentionally it must be protected, especially after being broken. On one quiet evening, weeks later, they returned to the town square. The lights were still there, the snow softer now, less ceremonial, more real. They stood side by side, not looking back, but forward. Hazel did not feel the need to define the future. She understood now that permanence is built in choices, not promises. Brian did not ask for certainty. He offered presence, and she accepted it freely, without fear. The letter that arrived on Christmas Eve was never meant to rewrite the past. It was meant to unlock it, to release what had been trapped in silence, so something truer could take its place. Not perfection, but honesty. Love returned to Hazel's life not as rescue, but as partnership, not as urgency, but as peace. She did not lose herself by choosing it again. She brought herself fully, and that made all the difference. Brian understood then that redemption is not dramatic. It is faithful. It shows up when it's uncomfortable. It stays when it's easier to leave. It does not erase consequences. It honors them and chooses differently next time. The town never knew the full story. They only saw two familiar faces walking closer together. What they couldn't see was the work beneath the surface, the courage, the restraint, the healing that came slowly, but sincerely. Hazel no longer feared Christmas. It no longer represented what she lost. It became a reminder of what was restored, not through miracles, but through truth, through growth, through choosing to stay. Brian no longer feared the past. He carried it with humility, as a reminder of who he was, and who he refused to be again. Love, he learned, was not about arriving ready. It was about becoming responsible and remaining. The night the letter arrived changed everything. Not because it brought answers, but because it demanded courage. And courage finally answered. Not loudly but honestly. And that was enough. Some love stories are not written in grand gestures. They are written in restraint, in accountability, in the quiet decision to face what once felt unbearable. Hazel and Brian's story was not perfect, but it was real. And real love stays. And so, on a Christmas shaped by truth and grace, love did not return to repeat the past. It returned to redeem it. One choice at a time. One honest moment after another. Because sometimes the letter arrives late, but but the heart finally arrives right on time. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever waited for words that came too late, or believed love had already passed you by, remember this. Redemption is never rushed. It's chosen. Subscribe to Redeemed Hearts for more stories about second chances, healing, and love that return stronger, not louder. Comment below. Have you ever had to forgive without forgetting? Or rebuild trust one honest moment at a time? Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of Christmas redemption, where broken hearts discover that staying can be the bravest choice of all. And if this story reminded you that love can still be redeemed, share it with someone who needs hope tonight.